So let's get on with it. So this is the title, Theories of Consciousness, which is what it will be about. Are they all wrong or all right? Now, I recently wrote a sort of review about all sorts of different theories of consciousness. You're not supposed to read all this. Where we looked at, 8 different theories of consciousness. Together with Georg Northoff, by the way. And I decided, well, that's probably a bit much for a single talk. So I decided to change my title to this, 2 Theories of Consciousness. Both wrong or both right, so to keep it a bit manageable. So what will this be about? Well, let me first do a little bit of history in the sense that take you through my own personal engagement with consciousness. I started by just simply asking a very simple question, which is, what makes us see this? And with this, of course, what I mean is that you perceive this square overlying a textured background. I mean, it's a very salient thingy, and you can almost grasp it. And of course, there's lots of perceptual grouping and other sorts of interesting visual stuff going on. So. I just wanted to know, how is it possible that this occurs, aside from any consciousness issues. So, some of you may know, so what I did, I recorded from monkey primary visual cortex with these small receptive fields to look at this neurophysiology of this phenomenon of perceptual organization. So you have a bunch of line segments in the receptive field, and then these line segments can belong to, like here, a homogeneous background, or they can belong to such a figure. And then what I found there, ages ago this is that up to something like 100 milliseconds, you get an exactly identical response for these 2 stimuli, indicating that until that moment in time, what the these primary visual cortical cells are looking at is, what is going on within that receptive field, and as that is exactly the same, the response is exactly the same. But then after 100 milliseconds, you get these modulations in the sense that you get a bigger response for this stimulus than for this stimulus, indicating that somehow this primary visual cortex activity is then modulated by the more global visual context of these stimuli. And this is what we call contextual modulation. And then what we also found was that if you look at different positions of the receptive field relative to such a figure, you get this modulation more or less all over the surface of such a figure, also indicated here. So we have these different positions of the receptive field relative to the figure, or the other way around, of course, because you record from a single unit all the time. And then you get these modulations, sort of stamped out activity for the whole figure relative to this background. So this looked like a nice neurophysiological correlate of figure-ground organization. And then what we also, of course, conjectured was that this because of the timing of these effects, was that it had something to do with feedback from higher level areas. And indeed, if we then lesioned higher level extrastriate cortex, so cortex after the primary visual cortex, you got rid of at least this central part of this modulation, as you can see here, indicating that indeed these modulations are, coming from what we then dubbed recurrent processing. So interactions between primary visual cortex and higher level areas, and then back again. So this was sort of the idea that came out of that, so that, at a latency of something like 50 milliseconds, in the monkey that is, you have these low-level feature detectors, like, cells detecting orientations, or different motions, or depth of colors, or what have you. And then, of course, this information is sent to higher-level areas, where you have these higher-level feature detectors, which are maybe, extracting more complex shapes, or what have you. And then somehow this is then combined by these recurrent interactions to form this integrated percept of a square made of oriented line segments. And what we also found was that this holds for all sorts of different ways in which figures may segregate from background, whether it's via depth, so disparity, or orientation, as shown before, or a combination of these features, or luminance, or color, or what have you. So it's really the case that these signals reflect the sort of perceptual organization outcome, which was also nicely illustrated by creating all sorts of difficult displays like this one, where you have a mode and frame, as it's called. So what we do there is that you have, via disparity, you can have either a square frame lying in front of the scene, or that the square frame is lying in the back, and then of course you see sort of a square floating into a, as illustrated here, floating in the midst of a moat. And of course this looks like a figure, whereas this looks like a frame, and then of course what you have here in the center is background. And then indeed the modulations follow the perceptual organization outcome, in the sense that here you get this modulation and here you don't. And so all sorts of things, strengthening the view that indeed these modulations reflect what we then call figure ground organization, or maybe more in general perceptual organization. So that was sort of the first part of my, by the way, PhD thesis work, also some postdoc work I did at MIT. And then at some point, because I didn't mention it yet, but we did all these recordings in awake behaving monkeys, so monkeys that had to fixate a screen and then, while we were recording. At some point we also recorded this in anesthetized monkeys, and then we found something, what I then found rather surprising, which is that if you look at these modulations, they totally disappear when you anesthetize the animal. Whereas what doesn't disappear is that these cells still respond, as you can see here. So these are the modulations you find in the awake, these are the modulations you find in the anesthetized animal, recorded with the same electrodes, because we used implanted electrodes already back then. So what you can see is that these cells still respond, so you still get this first peak of activity, which then dies out, which is typical what cortical neurons do. But the modulation is selectively gone. So that sort of seems, and of course, if you then look at things like orientation selectivity or direction selectivity, that's all the same between awake and anesthetized. The only thing that seems to have been suppressed by the anesthesia are these modulations that are mediated by these recurrent feedback interactions. So that sort of suggested to me, wait a second, there's something going on here. It's apparently a process that's only occurring when you are awake. And then maybe also that's only occurring when you have a conscious sensation of those figures overlying background. So that got me interested actually in this whole topic of consciousness. So it's quite an empirically driven interest, you might say. So then we did all sorts of other experiments to sort of show the same thing. So we did, and an obvious thing to do then, of course, is, for example, masking. So with masking, you present a stimulus, which is then followed by a mask. And then, of course, as a result of that, you have difficulty seeing that first stimulus. That's typical finding of backward masking, which we also find in a monkey. So a monkey was then trained to make a saccadic eye movement to the position of the figure. And then stimulus were masked with different stimulus and mask onset asynchronies. And then what you will typically find with pattern backward masking is something like this. So this is the line you see here. That's the psychometric function. So with stimulus onset asynchronies of up to, say, 3 monitor frames, which is like 50 milliseconds, you see that monkeys are more or less at chance, which is here, at detecting these figures. And then they get gradually better the longer the interval between stimulus and mask. And then if you look at the modulation, we saw a very similar behavior, in the sense that you don't get the modulation with these short SOAs and you do get the modulation with these longer SOAs. Again, indicating that, there is a relation between monkeys seeing these things and whether you get these recurrent interactions. Well, again, at the same time, these feed-forward activations, as you can see here, still remain in every situation. And that also suggested a mechanism for masking, which we conjectured as being as follows. So you present a stimulus, which is then activating primary visual cortex, and this activity is fed forward to higher level visual areas. And then, of course, normally this activity would then reach back to primary visual cortex, but now, because of the mask, activity in primary visual cortex is no longer about this first stimulus, but it's about the mask. And then, of course, in a functional sense, these recurrent interactions are no longer possible. And this is, we then thought, explaining why masking is in fact working, because it interrupts these recurrent interactions while not interrupting these feed-forward activations. Different experiments. This is dichoptic masking. In dichotic masking, you present two different stimuli to the two eyes. So here you have such a texture thingy in one eye and here also, but the orientations are orthogonal in the two situations, so that if you fuse such an image, what you get perceptually is that you don't see it anymore. And of course, if you have the square in one eye and the homogeneous one in the other eye, you still see it. It's a bit more vague, but you still see it. And then you get the modulation in this case and not in this case. So another example. And we did similar experiments in human subjects using this dichoptic masking again. So we presented faces like shown here. So this is more like sort of an iconic face, smiley face, again made up out of these kinds of line segments. And then you can, well, make the line segments such that you have a face in one eye and in the other eye. But if you fuse it, the face becomes invisible because the line segments all combine into crosses. Or you can make it this way so that in the fused image you still see the face. And then if you look at what happens in the human visual brain, it's very similar to what we found in the monkey, in the sense that you still get activation, for example, of fusiform face area for these invisible faces. Of course, the activity is a bit lower for the invisible than for the visible cases, but you still get selective activation of fusiform face area, in the sense that the activity is higher for faces than for other objects like houses or nonsense objects. So in that sense, the fusiform face area is still signaling, oh, well, there's a face here. But then if you look at some other things, what you will see is that, for example, in the EEG, that this invisible face is only evoking a short blip of activity in visual cortex, whereas the visible face is also showing this blip of activity, this feed-forward activation. But then at a later point in time, you get all sorts of extra activity for the visible, which you don't get for the invisible. And you also see things like stimulus-induced theta, beta, and gamma activity, which you don't see for the invisible case. But what I found most interesting is that if you look at the fMRI signals and you did a functional connectivity analysis, what you saw is that in the visible situation, you got fusiform face area reaching back to lower level visual areas, which you didn't get, at least to a much lower extent, for the invisible situation. And so again, indicating that in a situation like this, and also in the human brain, you have this difference between recurrent processing and feed-forward processing, in the sense that the feed-forward processing, the selective feed-forward processing, activation of fusiform face area and what have you, is still there, even if you don't see the face. It's the recurrent processing which is signaling whether you see the face or not. So you have all these manipulations that interfere with visibility, that interfere with these recurrent signals at the same time. Now, what does this mean? So is this, about the stimulus that you degrade, of course, with masking or with the dichoptic masking, or is it about, because people don't say that they see the stimulus, or is it about the response, they don't push buttons and stuff, or is it about the conscious percept? And this is important in the realm of the following. So what we have, of course, if we look at consciousness, is the following, well, you might say, problem. So of course, on the one hand, what you want to show is that there is a stimulus, of course, reaching the eye and then being processed by all sorts of, well, you may say mandatory sensory processing. So yeah, the eye typically always works more or less. Of course, subtleties going on there too, but in a sense that the eye is just doing what it does and doing what it does, and then in a sense it signals to the brain, and then at some point, of course, you get, well, what you may call the experience that you have from this stimulus. But then, of course, if you ask people or animals to then push buttons to indicate whether they saw it or not, or whatever paradigm you may use, of course you enter the domain of what we call decision processing, meaning that, they may have a phenomenal experience, but of course, depending on whether they decide to push buttons or not, or the decision threshold that they have, they may either push the button or not, or in the case of the monkey, make the saccadic eye movement, or not make a saccadic eye movement, so maintain fixation in that case. So at which of these stages are these signals that we are now looking at, these recurrent signals, actually happening? This is interesting also because we know that there may be dissociations between behavior and conscious perception. So most well-known example would be blindsight. Blindside also being shown in monkey, in the sense that if you have a lesion, a half-sided lesion of primary visual cortex in monkey, and then put him in a forced choice situation, in the sense that he always has to make a saccadic eye movement to either the stimulus in the intact hemifield or in the lesion hemifield, you will see that he will always make these saccadic eye movements, regardless of where the lesion sits. However, when you also give him the opportunity to maintain fixation, to indicate, well, I didn't see a stimulus here, you will see that he will make a saccadic eye movement in to the intact hemifield, but he will maintain fixation to the lesion hemifields. And of course, this has been used to indicate that indeed these monkeys suffer from blindside, in the sense that they don't perceive such stimuli in the blind hemifield, but they still make saccadic eye movements to them if forced, which is of course the hallmark of blindside also in humans. So we use the same paradigm in monkeys, where we again use the stimulus like these on the three different positions, three different possible positions, and then what the animals had to do was make a saccadic eye movement to such a figure, but we also presented catch trials in which there was also such a homogeneous screen, but now there was no figure. And in those trials, monkeys had to maintain fixation. So they could indicate to us, well, oh yeah, I saw a stimulus and it was sitting over there, by making the saccadic eye movement. Or they could indicate to us, no, there was no stimulus here, and then maintain fixation. Same as with the blindside paradigm. And then what you find is that on figure-present trials, so these are all trials where monkeys, where figures were presented. Of course, in most situations, the monkey made saccadic eye movements to the position of the. This is the position of the square where the receptive fields were we recorded. Of course, they also made these saccadic eye movements to other positions, but this is just for that position. And on these catch trials, they mostly maintain fixation. However, as you may notice, also on some of the trials where figures were present, they maintained fixation, as if indicating, well, didn't see a figure here. And of course, they also made some erroneous eye movements. That's, yeah, well, monkeys. So in the end, that resulted in 80% of these figure trials where the monkey responded, oh yeah, I saw the figure and it was sitting over there. And then you can of course record either a figure or a background response again. But also with these, you also had these 8% of these trials where monkeys responded, oh, I didn't see one here. And then you can record figure and background responses. And what's important to notice is that we then looked at the activity preceding the saccadic eye movement. So this is the distribution of these saccadic eye movements to these stimuli. They start at around 250 milliseconds, which is, by the way, also a bit later than when you do a forced choice situation. The blue ones are again the erroneous ones, where you can see from the timing that indeed they're just messing around there. And then of course you can look at the modulation again preceding that activity, which we did here, so up to 240 milliseconds. Because of course once the eye movement starts, primary visual cortex goes all berserk, so not very sensible to look at the activity later than that. And then we observed this striking finding, which is that in all those trials where monkeys reported seeing the figure, you got the modulation, and in all those trials where monkeys reported not seeing the figure, you still get the activation of primary visual cortex, but you selectively, again, don't get the modulation. So it's very much like the anesthesia experiment, but now, of course, in an awake monkey, sometimes not seeing these figures. Apparently something like this happens. Stimulus arrives in primary visual cortex, it's fed forward to extrastriate areas, and then one of two things may happen, which is that, then somehow the activity sort of dies out. Or visual cortex engages in these recurrent interactions, and then you get the modulation, and the monkey says, "Oh yeah, I saw it." Sort of a spontaneous blindness, and then maybe also blind sight. Now you may wonder, what's going on there? Because why is this happening, or is this happening? A bit difficult to answer, but of course we looked at that. So we looked at the activity preceding these trials, and you have to know that. Preceding the stimulus screen, we also had this pre-stimulus screen, which was sort of a random oriented line segments. And what we observed was that preceding not reported or not seen stimuli, the activity was a bit lower compared to the other trials. But this was not an effect of focused attention in the sense that it was only happening here. The activity was lower all over the place. So regardless of whether the figure were presented here or there, you get this difference between the seen or not seen responses. So it's more like a general elevation of activation that's, well, at least indicative of the one or the other thing happening. And what we also found was this. If you look at the activity again preceding, that's what you get, the preceding stimulus onset, so stimulus onset is here, and then look at synchrony between neurons, because we recorded from multiple electrodes at the same time, you'll see that preceding the arrival of the stimulus, you get this peak of synchronous activity, sort of in expectation of what's going on there. But this synchronous activity is high for reported ones and lower for not reported trials. And which is also shown here. So correlation coefficients, this is cross-correlograms, correlation coefficients are generally higher for the reported cases than for the not reported cases. Now, whether this all explains why in some trials, the monkeys see the stimuli and in other trials they don't, yeah, of course, that's sort of, I don't know whether this really suffices as a full explanation, but at least it gives you some indication of what's going on there. Apparently the brain enters a sort of more synchronized and more elevated activity kind of state, and then the monkey is perceiving the squares. And if the activity is a bit lower and a bit less synchronized, well, then they don't. Now, of course, still you have this question, what are these modulations then exactly reflecting? Is it the percept or is it the imminent report? Because of course after this you get the eye movement, and after this you don't get the eye movement. So is it maybe sort of a pre-saccadic modulation or something? Again, of course, entering this issue, is it about something going on here? Is it about the decision process, or is it about the motor response? Now, to study that, we use these kinds of stimuli, but then with different saliency. So this is the one with line length, or the length of these line segments is 16. This is when you shorten the line segments to 8 by 1 pixels, and this is 4 by 1 pixels, and you can already see that it becomes a bit more difficult to see there. And this is with a line length of 2 pixels, 2 versus 1. Strictly taken, it's still oriented, but it's sort of impossible to see the figure again here. And then what you get, of course, if you look at the behavior of the monkeys, is that the catch trial behavior remains the same. And so catch trials is always a screen where there's no figure at all. And this is what the number of saccadic eye movements, the percentage of monkeys indicating I saw the figure, is for these different line lengths. And of course it goes down. And the other way, not seen responses go up to the point that for line length 2, indeed, monkeys never make eye movements anymore. But of course, these are interesting situations where you have line length of 4 and 8. So what's going on there? Now, again, a bit to my own surprise, what we found there was what, to me at least at the start, was sort of a puzzling observation, which is that the seen-not seen difference, which I showed you in the beginning, so all the modulation when the monkey says seen and no modulation at all when the monkey said not seen, sort of diminished with the somewhat shorter line length, L8, and was totally, well, not significant anymore with a line length of 4. And of course with L2 you don't have any data there. So what's going on there? Well, of course, for one thing, it indicates that at least that this modulation is not about making the eye movement. Because if that would have been the case, of course you would have found this difference in all these situations. Because, seen is always making the eye movement and not seen is not making the eye movement. So if it would be about that, you would have found all this in all these situations. So now we have a sort of puzzling situation which indicates that it's not mandatory purely sensory processing. It's also not the motor response. So where are we? Is it something about the decision process, or indeed is it about the monkey seeing or not seeing these squares? Now we could explain these findings indeed by looking at a formal decision model as follows. So suppose you have a high saliency stimulus. Of course, that gives you a high saliency internal representation, a strong neural signal. And that's what you have here. This bar is representing this neural signal. And then, of course, if you have a decision criterion sitting somewhere there, and of course this decision criterion may vary a bit, you can imagine that because the internal signal is so strong, it's always above the decision criterion, and then all these trials are converted into a scene response. And of course, what then happens is that in some trials, well, it says 10% here, but in actuality it was 8%, but that doesn't really matter, of course. This internal representation does not build up, so there's no recurrent processing, and then of course the signal will be below the decision criterion, and then monkey will always say not seen. That's with the high saliency. But now look at what happens if you have a low saliency stimulus and hence also a low saliency signal. Now this low saliency signal may of course be sort of just around the decision threshold, and then what you get is that even though you have these recurrent interactions going on, but they are a bit weaker because the stimulus is weaker, you get that in these trials the monkey, depending on where the decision criterion happens to sit relative to the signal, the monkey may say, oh yeah, I saw it, so he gives a seen response, or he gives a not seen response. And then of course for these, again, you have the 10% where nothing happens, and then of course the monkey always says nothing happened. So from that you can see that the lower the saliency, the more you approach a situation where you get 50-50 between seen, not seen responses for the situation where even a stimulus is presented. Now, of course, this is an idea we had, and we thought, well, how can we test this? Well, of course, you can test this by lowering the decision criterion, which is exactly what happened. So, if you lower or higher the decision criterion, of course, what you can get is that with a particular signal, you can either go from all the monkeys always saying yes to situations where monkeys, if you heighten the decision criterion, where monkeys either say yes or no, a bit depending on chance. And how can you higher or lower the decision criterion? Well, by manipulating the number of cat trials. You can imagine that if there's lots of cat trials, monkeys sort of get in a situation where they think, it's probably a cat trial. So only if they really are really convinced that there was a figure, they will say, oh no, this is really a figure. And so that makes you elevate the decision criterion. Whereas if you have 0% cat trials, of course it becomes sort of a forced search situation, and then they will always try to make these eye movements to the correct position. And then of course what you would expect, as shown here, is that with this lower criterion you will also find this difference seen versus not seen for the L4 situation, so the shorter line length, and conversely with the high criterion, 50% cat trials, you will see the same phenomenon of turning, the modulation becoming independent of seen, not seen, even for the high long line length, so for the high saliency stimulus, and that's basically exactly what we found. So what this tells us is that, these recurrent signals in V1, are, well, as I said, representing a state that's not purely sensory and also not representing the decision outcome, but it's really something about, what we'd end up phenomenal experience. So it's what the monkey is seeing, and then of course based on what he's seeing, he's going into the decision process, but that's later on. And of course it's also not, it's not just this, it's not the mandatory sensory processing, and also not this, but it's this. So on the basis of that, we had the following idea of how this works, how consciousness works. So in this feed-forward sense, you have feature detection and all these orientations detections, what have you, and of course this is conveyed to higher level areas where you have higher level feature detection. By the way, that means that faceness is also a high level feature, because with the FFA activation that you get in the feed-forward sense. But then you get these recurrent interactions. On the basis of this, the monkey has the experience of seeing a square or not, and then the animal enters into decision states and then reports what he sees or not. But of course, as I said, that depends on all sorts of things like decision thresholds. And this is from another figure where we sort of coined that whole idea. So that there is a difference between having conscious percepts and reporting about these conscious percepts. But most importantly, also that the key essence, or the what's really determining whether you have a conscious sensation or not, is this difference between feed-forward or recurrent processing. So we put it in a two-dimensional scheme. That's always nice. So you can either have shallow feed-forward processing or deep feed-forward processing, where you go all the way up to prefrontal cortex and stuff. We did lots of experiments also showing that can happen. But this is all about depth of processing. But it's still feed-forward. And because it's feed-forward, it's unconscious. And then, of course, these areas may also engage in these recurrent interactions, either being, confined to visual cortex or indeed encompassing the whole brain. Also differs in depth of processing, but both of these, elicit conscious experiences. Of course, these elicit visual conscious experiences, and these elicit visual conscious experiences plus, some sort of cognitive sauce added to it. And of course, this also very much relates to another phenomenon which we call attention. So, of course, depth of processing, we know, is also very much determined by whether you attend to a visual stimulus, and the same holds for these recurrent interactions. Typically, these recurrent interactions stay confined to visual cortex when there's no attention to them, and when you have attention, you get engagement of prefrontal cortex, parietal stuff, what have you. So this is in a nutshell this recurrent processing theory. So it takes this distinction between feed-forward and recurrent or re-entrant processing as sort of fundamental to understanding consciousness. At some point I even coined it the neural definition of consciousness. For one thing, because the feed-forward activation gives you all these features and categories and all sorts of categorizations. But only when you integrate all this information via these recurrent interactions, you get you get perceptual organization, but you also get conscious perception then. Now, how is this different from another major theory, more major I would say, of consciousness, which is global neuronal workspace theory? Because in global neuronal workspace theory, there's also this re-entrant signaling and global ignition, etc., being taken, is very vital for the neural correlate of consciousness. Just to mention a few things about that. So global neuronal workspace theory, of course, championed by people like Dehane, Changeux, Nakash, good friends, by the way. But so they also make a distinction between what they call subliminal, in the sense that you have some sort of activation of, a few visual areas, say, but it's fairly weak, maybe only feed forward. And then something which they call preconscious, which is recurrent, but not all that strong activation, but somewhat higher than this, of say a few visual areas of stuff. But in their view, it's only conscious because, when it's attended and reaching this global workspace. Global workspace enabling broadcasting to other modules of the brain, and also enabling a process that they call access. And this this global workspace activation typically means activation of this large frontal-parietal network with these large cell-bodied neurons with long axons and stuff. But they also champion this idea that indeed once you get activation of this frontal network, you get recurrent reverberating activation, which they then call global ignition. But this typically happens later than the things I talked about, typically at a latency about 300 to 400 milliseconds. So, and what they also, I think maybe do a bit differently is that what they typically do to find these kinds of findings is that they contrast stimuli that are reported as seen versus stimuli that are reported as not seen. So a good example would be attentional blink paradigms. So attentional blink, you present a stimulus and then a target, and people have to respond to the target, and then say 200 milliseconds later you have a second target which people also have to respond to, and then typically what you get is that the second target is missed. Attention blinking a bit. And then they look at the processing of such a second missed target, and then what they find is that Only when you see such a target, you get this global ignition, frontal activation. And so, for example, so here, the unseen, so the missed target is weak activation in frontal areas, and the seen is high activation in frontal areas. So it's a very frontal theory. And indeed, what they argue is, again, they have a 2x2 framework, which is, well, in fact, identical to the one I just showed you, where you have this feed forward. Well, I think they mean that, but they're not very explicit on that. But this sort of weak feed forward activation, which is subliminal, and if it's unattended, it's not as deep as when it's attended. By the way, they don't mention that you can also get frontal activation there. But then you have these recurrent signals which stay confined to visual cortex, but they don't want to call that conscious. They say that's preconscious. Now, of course, you may say, well, isn't that just semantics? No, it's not, because they are really of the conviction that only when you get this prefrontal involvement, so you get this widespread recurrent activation, that only then you have a conscious percept, also in the perceptual sense. You have access, of course, to what they call it. So this raises a question, which is, well, where is this transition? So where does this, this whole idea, this whole sense of seeing something, where is this magic happening, as I always call it? So is it, from there to there, so from feed forward to local recurrent, or is it only from local recurrent to globally recurrent? What's going on there? And of course, this also relates to, this whole issue of finding the true neural correlate of consciousness, as these authors have called it. So that, of course, we have things preceding consciousness, which are required for having a conscious sensation, like, your eyes working and activity going into visual cortex and what have you. But that in itself may not be sufficient, or may not be the true NCC, but maybe a precursor of consciousness. Then, of course, you have activity which is really about the conscious experience, and then you have all sorts of stuff following the conscious experience, and then enabling people to say stuff, push buttons, and what have you. And of course, one of the things that have been argued is that this whole prefrontal activation, P3B activation, all the things that are championed by global workspace theory are in fact more of this, so consequences of consciousness than this. I'm not, of course I co-authored the paper on that, but I'm not necessarily of the opinion that this is all there is to this story, but there are of course some interesting experiments there. For example, these experiments where if you indeed abolish the report of things that are, of paradigms where we typically study consciousness, like binocular rivalry. So in binocular rivalry, of course, you can either see this or the other stimulus. And of course, what you then try to find is to what extent, you find correlates of what people see. So when they see this, whether you see correlates of this, and when you see this, whether you see correlates of that. Very popular way of studying neural concepts of consciousness. But of course, what you always have there too is that people then respond via button presses or so. Well, now I see this, or now I see this. But you can get rid of those, because with these kinds of stimuli, where you have moving gratings, what you can get is that what you then typically get is optokinetic nystagmus. So you move your eyes, a bit like this. So you follow the movement, and then you jerk back. You make a saccadic eye movement back, and then you follow the stimulus again, and then you make a saccadic eye movement back. So this is also an indication of what, and this depends on what you perceive in such a binocular rivalry situation. So this is also a way to follow what people are perceiving, and if you do that, you see, activation related to these switches, but you don't get the prefrontal activation that you get when people also have to report these switches. Some other experiments, let me go through these. I mean, it's just all sorts of experiments that this P3B is not so much a marker of the experience, but more of the report. So if you, again, another experiment where they show that if you abolish the report, you don't get this frontal activation. Same with inattentional paradigms. Same story. I mean, let's go over this. Sort of indicating that indeed, this is actually where the phenomenology happens, where it gets explained, and that this happens yeah, independent of attention, access, and most importantly, report. Now, of course, this is problematic for the global workspace theory, but of course, on the other hand, yeah, what this means is that we have, what this means is that we then have conscious sensations going on here without attention, access, and report. So conscious sensations that you, basically don't know about. I think a good example are these kinds of change blindness and inattentional blindness experiments. Let's have a very brief look at one of these things. So try to...
In this experiment, a subject comes up to a counter and a first experimenter hands them a consent form. As soon as they finish signing the consent form, they hand it back to the first experimenter, who then takes the consent form, ducks down behind the counter to put it away, and a different experimenter then stands up and hands the subject a packet of information and sends them into a hallway where we...
Yeah, so in the interest of time, so it's a well-known phenomenon that that people don't notice these kind of changes. So they're looking at the person standing in front of them, but they just don't notice the switch. And this change blindness, and it's the same with inattentional blindness, where you don't see these gorillas which are walking through scenes. Attentional blink, we just mentioned that, but of course also neurological issues like neglect and extinction, where you have patients which have damage to the right hemisphere, and all sorts of attentional deficits, which also cause people to not see stuff, or at least report not seeing stuff. And what you have here are, of course, fairly different manipulations of conscious experience. You have these visibility manipulations, like anesthesia, masking. I've talked about those, rivalry and stuff. And then you have these more kinds of attentional manipulations. All sorts of different reasons, basically. What you're having here is for people, at least introspectively, having the idea that they didn't see anything. And indeed, these different reasons for not seeing things can have fairly different neural consequences. This is a particularly nice experiment where the visibility manipulation, like masking, was combined with an attentional manipulation, like attentional blink, in a single experiment. So what they had here was these kinesa images, which we have shown to also involve recurrent interactions between visual cortex. But these were made invisible either by masking, so there's a stimulus and then mask, or by attentional blink. So you have a stimulus, it's not masked, so it's in itself it's clearly visible, but then it's followed by another target, and then if there's a short lag, you don't notice the second target. So it's attentional blink. And then what was decoded from visual cortex was either the contrast between the kinesa thingy or not, so the perceptual integration, you might say, contrast, or the feature contrast, in the sense that this had typically, these kinds of kinesa stimuli had lower contrast and these had higher contrast. All sorts of different versions were used. But low contrast versus low versus high perceptual integration. And then what you can see is that at short latencies, this is EEG recordings, at short latencies you can record the feature contrast, so the high versus low contrast, whereas at longer latencies you can record the perceptual integration contrast, or decode the perceptual integration contrast. And then if you look at the difference between masking and attentional blink, you see the following, which is that this feature contrast you can always decode, regardless of whether you mask stuff or whether you do attentional blink. You can always decode this, but the feature integration contrast you can only decode when things are attentionally blinked, but you can no longer decode them when things are masked. So in that sense, there's a real difference between things that are invisible because of masking or things that are invisible because of attentional blink. The attentional blink typically is not causing you to lose these recurrent interactions, whereas the masking is. And we looked, in a recent review, I looked at all sorts of different visual functions that either depend on these feed-forward activations, like feature detection, base groupings, high-level feature detections, or these visual functions that more depend on recurrent processing, like indeed groupings and perceptual organization and stuff like that. And what you then get is that indeed these visibility, if you look at all that literature, the visibility manipulations typically interfere with functions that are related to perceptual organization and integration, whereas attention and access do not interfere with any of these. So all these visual functions can go on pretty fine on their own. They don't need attention. Of course, they get modulated by attention, but they don't need them. Whereas the other manipulations really interfere with those. And of course, the feed-forward activations are not interfered by anything. So this tells you a different story, which is that the feed-forward activation, that's doing all the feature detection and categorization and what have you, and then you get the recurrent interactions, which is giving you perceptual organization. By the way, this is also shown in things like NT200, visual awareness, negativity, and all sorts of other neural signals that you can record. But then you get these frontal activation, which is giving you, well, more or less the notion, well, I think I saw that. So the more cognitive aspects of the conscious percept. So this is the difference between invisible, visible. This is the difference between inattended and attended. And another thing we've also noticed is that indeed this processing has a way higher capacity than this type of processing. These are these change blindness iconic memory experiments, where we show that if you do a typical change blindness experiment, you will see that people only have capacity to monitor a few of these objects, whereas if you do an iconic memory version of the experiment, you will see that people have the capability of monitoring all these objects for a change. Indicating that if you look at a stimulus, actually two sorts of representations sit in your head. So there's this purely visual representation which sits in visual cortex, which has large capacity. It's fairly fragile in the sense that it's easily overwritten with a new visual stimulus, and it depends on visual cortex. And then you have this more frontal representation, which is relating on attention, which has a smaller capacity, typical capacity limit, and as I said, depending on frontal cortex. And this is the overflow argument, and so we can see way more than we can attend, memorize, or report. So there's basically two kinds of magic happening here. So here you go from dark to seeing, but here you go from seeing to knowing. Yeah, and of course, which is the real magic? That's maybe just, I don't know, a silly question. They're both interesting magics. It just depends on what you're interested in. So if you're interested in what makes this image in our heads happening, I would say go for the first one. But if you're interested in how can I deal with this information, how can I base my decisions, base my life on these phenomenal experiences, well, then you should go for the second theory, I would say. And of course, this is also known as the difference between what we call phenomenal consciousness, P consciousness, and access consciousness, A consciousness. And by the way, this is a distinction that you also see in different theories of consciousness. And so one of the other theories that's investigated in these Templeton adversarial collaborations is what's called higher order thought theory. Now, of course, I have no time at all to deal with this theory. Well, I may say respectively, but basic idea there is also, you have these first order representations, which are all nice, but it's only becoming really conscious when you have a higher order re-representation, which then typically is thought to sit in frontal cortex. So in that sense, this is also more like a theory about knowing what you see. You might say typical paradigms used there are, for example, metacognition paradigms and stuff like that. But these representations are about these first order representation, and not surprisingly, they are called thoughts. By the way, these thoughts may not necessarily are verbal thoughts. And this is in stark contrast, for example, with integrated information theory. This is a theory which is way more close, but way more mathematically specified, and all sorts of other benefits it also has relative to plain recurrent processing theory. But this theory also holds, that basically what makes us see is, integrated information, as they call it, but highly depending on recurrent interactions again, in visual cortex. So what we end up here are, if we look at these theories of consciousness, of course there are way more, but they sort of seem to come in two different brands, you might say, which each having their own flavors. But most importantly, they seem to have really different things they aim to explain. So they have these, you could say you have these more sensory theories like integrated information theory, recurrent processing theory. They are really about stuff like perceptual organization, integration, binding. But introspectively, they are really about you may say the raw seeing, the seeing itself. Whereas you have these frontal theories like global neuronal workspace theory, higher order thought theory. Yeah, they are about attention, access, report, metacognition. They are about, knowing what you see. And it's just, what are you more interested in that determines which theory you should prefer. Thank you.